In this video, I'll be showing you how to create a GitHub repository. Let's go right into create our first repository. Let's go on to create a repository with GitHub. So to get started, you come to your browser, any browser of your choice. You can come to your Google browser, you type github.com, GitHub, or you can cite github.com. And then once you have github.com, it takes you to this Google search page. You can select the first page here, which is let's build from here. So you click on let's build from here. And if you don't have an email account or if you don't have a GitHub repository, you can go on to put an account and email address here, and you'll be able to create a GitHub repository. Or if you already have an account with Gmail, whatever the case, you come up to the site here and you type sign in, or you can select sign in. Once you select sign in, you'll be required to put in a username and a password. So we're going to put in a username and password. I'll be putting in my username and password. If you do not have an account, you can still come here and create an account. So to get started, you put the username. So I'll be putting mine DevOps with Mike. I'll put in my email, and then for the password, I'll put my password. And once you do it, put in the right credentials, you can sign in. Now I've set up two-factor authentication on my Gmail account. Now I've set up two-factor authentication on my GitHub account, and I'll be putting in my two-factor authentication code, which I'll pick for my authenticator app. If you do not have authentication set up, you do not need to bother about this step. Not all the accounts have two-factor authentication set up. The two-factor authentication helps your account from being hacked by some malicious individuals. So I'll put in the authentication code, which I get from my authentication application. So let me put in the code. And now once the code is verified, it will take you to your dashboard. If you do not have any project or any repository in your GitHub account, you'll be seeing all of these. But if you already have existing repositories, you can always come and click on create a new repository, or you can come to the top here and you should see available repositories. You see status, the name of your repository, your profile, your repositories, Copilot, your organizations, your enterprises, and so on. But the purpose of this video is for us to create a repository. So you can either select here to create a new repository, you can click on create new repository, you can equally create here, or you can come here. So first, let's click here, you select your repositories. Once you select your repositories, if you do not have any repository, all of these will be empty. But if you do have a repository, you have different representations here. So for us to create a new repository, you click on new, and then the repository, of course, you want to name your repository based on, or well, you want to name your repository with the name that you often use when referencing a repository. So if I want to create a repository to store S3 configuration, to store Terraform configuration, I can call this Terraform infra repo, and then you can give it the description. This repository stores Terraform configuration files. So this will be a description that will be used to reference to this repository. You can either make this repository public, means that anyone on the internet can see this repository. You can allow it as private, or you can either make this repository public, meaning anyone on the internet can see this repository, or you can make it private, means that only those you choose access to will be able to access this repository. But for this case, we allow the repository as public. And then now to initialize this repository, you can add a README file. A README file is a compository file that you can use to describe whatever configurations you'll be having in this repository. So first, we have the name of the repository, Terraform infra repository. You give the repository if you want to add a README file, you can add a README file. The repository can either be public or private. Once you select public or private, you change the status based on the access that you want to have for this repository. Once you put in these details, all you need to do is click on create repository. Now once you click on create repository, this repository will be created. The name of the repository still comes in the README file which you optionally selected. So we have the Terraform infra repo in our README file. This repository stores Terraform configuration. This was basically the description. Now you see the repository does not have anything. As far as this repository is concerned, you have the code, which is everything you should be storing here. You have the branches. This is the main branch. A repository is always created with a default main branch. You can also have the possibility to add files. You can create new files in this repository. You can upload files, And then if you want to get this repository down, you want to be able to clone this repository, you can download this repository as a zip file which you can open, or you can copy this repository link and clone. You can check out the next video on how to clone a repository. So if you click here, you'll be able to clone this repository. So you can equally fork this repo. Forking the repo means that you want to have a version of this repo that you will not, or well, forking a repo basically means, or to create a fork basically is a copy of the repository. So whatever will be done with the fork of this repository will not affect the original repo. So you can create a fork of the repository, and then you can also see issues with respect to the repositories. If you want to set up CI/CD for this repository, you can create actions with GitHub Actions, where GitHub gives the possibility to have a CI/CD deployment. So you can have maybe a deployment to deploy a Node.js application on Amazon ECS, whatever the case. So you can set up CI/CD with GitHub Actions for this repository. You can view pull requests, people wanting to put information into this repository as pull requests. You can see some of these pull requests here. And then equally, you can configure security of this repository based on who can push. You can set up some basic configurations, and then you can have settings for this repository. This is where the main setting takes place. Collaborators on this repository who can actually commit changes to this repository, who can push to this repository. If you want to change it to a private repository, you can change the visibility here. You can also see the branches that this repository has here. You can change different default branches. You can view most especially the webhooks. The webhook gives you the possibility to connect this repository to other tools, maybe like Jenkins. Then you can equally configure environments that you might want to use. So environments are used for, or are used by your workflows. So we also talked about actions. You can set up general GitHub action to allow this repository for use in your CI/CD processes. And then you can equally configure deployment keys for this repository. If you need some deployment keys, secrets and variables, should in case you want to set up a GitHub action, and then you can configure email notifications and all of that. So all this is basically how you can use to create a repository. Again, if you come back to your dashboard, you see details about use. If you come back to your dashboard, you see a new repository that was created. So you have the Terraform infra repository, and then you can equally, if you want to create a new repository again, you come here, you click on your repositories. You'll be able to see all repositories in your environment. If you need a new repository, you click on new, and then you can give the repository name, the repository description. You can select if it's public or private, and then you can add a README file if you want to have a descriptive file for this repository, and then you click on create repository. So this is basically how you can create a GitHub repository to store your configuration code and your configuration files.